Take your Bibles and open up with me to 1 Samuel chapter 13. And as we're kind of moving through the Bible together, we run into the story of King Saul. And you're going to hit that this week as you begin to read, and you're going to begin to understand some of the challenges that were going on in Saul's life. When I read 1 Samuel, I always feel a little bit tormented for Saul. I recognize he's doing some really horrendous things. He's picking up a spear. He's throwing it at his son. He's hunting down King David. I realize he's doing that, but Saul seems to me to almost be like a tormented soul. And as I begin to read this week, and as I begin to look in my own life at things, I think I captured some of the reasons why he struggled. So you're in 1 Samuel 13. We're going to look at the first event that brings about his rejection. But before we do that, just let me point out a couple of thoughts for you out of 1 Samuel 9 and 10. And here's the first thing you need to know. These are the things that God gave to King Saul. God gave Saul a new heart, equipped him, and promised him his presence, yet Saul chose fear over faith. That sounds a lot like most of us, right? So look with me at you're in 1 chapter 13, but look with me at 1 Samuel chapter 10 for just a moment. And here's the story. King Saul's father said to him one day, "Hey, listen, we've lost the donkeys. Can you go find them?" King Saul gets up, and he goes out to find the donkeys. Now, to really understand what's happening, you got to look back at chapter 8, verse 19. For there it says, "But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, their prophet or their seer. And they said, 'No, but there shall be a king over us, that we may be like all the other nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles.'" Okay? Sounds like a pretty selfish position. We want to be like everybody else, and we want him to fight our battles so we won't have to. And God says, "Okay, that's what you keep demanding, then I'll provide for that." So here's what happens. God says to Samuel, "I'm going to find a king." And at the same time, the donkeys wander off. Now just watch this. We think the donkeys are wandering off just because they think the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, but God's involved in this. King Saul's father says to him, "Listen, go find the donkeys." And off he walks to find the donkeys. He goes to multiple locations, can't find them. God says to Samuel, "Hey, listen, the guy who's going to be king, he's going to come looking for the donkeys." Okay? Now, this is the story. King Saul shows up. He says, "Listen, we're out of food, we're out of bread, we're out of everything. Would God tell you where our donkeys were?" And Samuel begins this incredible conversation with him as if to say, "Listen, you are one of the most desirable in Israel. God is going to use you," right? And look at Saul's answer in verse 21. It's the right answer. His response afterward isn't. He says, "Am I not a Benjamite from the least of the tribes of Israel? And is not my clan the humblest of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then have you spoken to me in this way?" He doesn't know yet he's going to become king, right? He just thinks he's looking for donkeys. I mean, just imagine this for a moment, okay? Chapter 10, verse 1. "Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head and kissed him and said, 'Has not the Lord anointed you to be prince over the people of Israel? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their surrounding enemies.'" Okay? Now, here's what happens. Saul takes that information, even though chapter 10, verse 9 tells us, look at it real quickly, when he turned his back to leave Samuel, God gave him, that is Saul, another heart, literally a new heart in replacement for him. Some have said, well, that's just the Spirit of God laid upon him. Some have said that's a spiritual regeneration. We're not sure what it is, but we do know this, that God gave him a new heart. And look earlier at verse 7. "Now when these things meet you, do not do what your hand finds to do, for God is with you." So God's equipped him. God gave him a new heart. God is with him. God has promised him his presence. Okay? So he finds the donkeys. He returns home. Look at this, verse 15. "And Saul's uncle said to him, 'Please tell me what Samuel said to you.' And Saul said to his uncle, 'He told us plainly that the donkeys had been found.' That's true. But about the matter of the kingdom of which Samuel had spoken, he did not tell him anything." You say, why wouldn't he tell him he's king? Right? If you look over at verse 22, verse 20, "Then Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot." He's communicating now to the whole community that they have a king. He brought the tribe of Benjamin near by the clans, and the clan of the Matrites was taken by Lot. And Saul the son of Kish was taken by Lot. But when they sought him, he could not be found. So they inquired again of the Lord, is there a man still to come? And the Lord said, behold, he has hidden himself in the baggage. Are you with me in that? Like, this is a man who just was anointed king. He doesn't tell anybody, and when they get ready to have, as it were, his coronation, he hides. Begin to think about that. I don't know about you, but I think everybody struggles with some degree of insecurity. Everyone struggles with insecurity in some area. Even the most confident people do. Such insecurity will either bring a greater dependence on the Lord or the habit of hiding. The latter will only give the appearance that you are secure, but not the reality. Furthermore, it imprisons you in the habit of keeping up that appearance. Now, just for a moment, picture this. Everybody in here today probably has some issue in their life that they feel pretty insecure about. You say, well, I do, but I know some people that are really confident here, Phil, so I'm sure they don't. They seem to have it all together. Hold on. Everybody I've ever met can feel confident in some area of their life and feel really insecure in some other areas of their life. And here's what we tend to do. Like Saul, we acknowledge we're the least of the least of the least, but then we either turn to the Lord in that and say, by God's grace, I'll try this, or we just start to hide. Okay? And when we get into that habit of hiding, the more we hide, you know what happens? The more we have to keep hiding to keep up that appearance, because now people think we got it all together. And so we spin this plate and say, okay, it looks like I got it all together over here. Now I better spin this plate. You think my family's all together. You think my work's all together. You think my church is all together. Everybody thinks everything's all together. And we keep spinning those plates as opposed to simply saying, in this area, I'm pretty weak, and I'm just trying to trust the Lord for help. Okay? Like Saul, we create the habit of hiding. Now, if you know Saul's life, you know how dangerous this is. Because Saul not only creates the habit of hiding, but then he starts to hide other things. Like he hides how he feels about David initially. Remember that? And Jonathan and David work this thing out, and David says, listen, tell him that I went back to Bethlehem and that I'm not here at dinner time just to see if he's really upset at me. Why do they not know he's upset at him? Because he hasn't actually said, David, I'm really struggling with this. To be perfectly honest with you, I don't like the fact that you're anointed king and I'm supposed to be the king. Okay? Instead, he says nothing. Instead, he just waits until Jonathan addresses him, and then he throws a spear at his son. What did he just do? He had the habit of hiding for so long that it just burst forward in an explosion of wrath and anger. Here's what you got to know about every person who either grows silent in their anger or they explode in their anger. You've got to know that they have a habit of hiding. They're hiding something. And ultimately, that comes out in a way that doesn't seem to mesh with the rest of everything else that's going on in their life. You know why that habit's there? Because when they faced their own insecurities, they did not turn to the Lord in dependence on him humbly. Instead, they sought to simply try to put up the appearance of it. King David's like, compared to Goliath, who's 9'6", King David is a very, very little guy, right? And yet, he knows he can't battle Goliath unless he does it in the Lord's strength. And that's what he says. He looks at Goliath and says, hey, you think you're all that important? God will give you over into our hands today because our God is mightier than you are. See what he just did? He said, I'm not strong enough to take you out, but my God is. That's not the position of Saul. Saul's hovering back in the tent as the king that's supposed to lead the people into battle, saying, I don't know what to do, but I know I can't do that. So he, again, is hiding. Here's what I want you to think about. There is no help for you if you're always hiding. It is the humble God exalts, not the prideful. What you and I need to do is bring the kind of humility that David had at times in his life, not the insecurity that is revealed through the pride that Saul had. Is Saul a bad king? You bet he is. But working beneath the surface of all the wrong things he does is this thing that starts at the very beginning of his king career, and that is this: he's hiding. He's not telling anybody he's the king. He's hiding in the baggage. When they finally pull him out of the baggage, it's almost humorous because he's a foot taller than everybody else, right? Where's the guy that's a head taller than everybody else? And then he's got to kind of stand up, and everybody says, oh, there's our king, the king who was hiding in the luggage. Why? Because he had a habit of hiding. Now, with that in mind, we jump into 1 Samuel chapter 13. And here's what we read. In his first battle, this is his second battle, he battled the Amorites and did really, really well because he trusted the Lord and he went forward. But by the time he gets to chapter 13, he runs into the Philistines. Verse 5. And the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel 30,000 troops like the sand of the seashore in the multitude, and 30,000 chariots. Now, if you have an NIV, it's going to read 3,000 chariots. That's because there's a manuscript difference between some of the more ancient manuscripts. But regardless of what it is, it's a lot more chariots than the Israelites have, okay? And 6,000 horsemen and troops, like the sand on the seashore in multitude. They came up and encamped at Michmash to the east of Beth-aven. And when the men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, for the people were hard-pressed, the people hid themselves in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and in cisterns. And some Hebrews crossed the fords of the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. That is, they just got out of town, right? They just ran across the river. So Saul was still at Gilgal. He was staying there, and all the people followed him trembling. Now, the people who followed him trembling aren't all the people. They're his army, okay? Now, bear in mind, they'd had a victory, and so Saul said, hey, we got a victory, so let me blow the horn and say, hey, we're going to be victorious. And what he gets are 3,000 men. Okay? But at the same time, the Philistines hear it, and what they send are somewhere between 3,000 and 30,000 chariots alone, right, with this whole multitude of people that are so many you can't even count. And so all of a sudden, the 3,000 and the King Saul divides into 2,000 and 1,000, keeps 2,000 for himself and sends 1,000 over with Jonathan, his son. All of a sudden, 3,000 doesn't seem like a very big number anymore. And everybody gets real rattled, right? And so that's who's trembling, the soldiers who are staying with him. Can you just think about this for a second? Here's your army, right? And you're trying to get your army out there to be brave and courageous, and you spend all your time pulling them out of caves and cisterns and tombs, saying, what are you doing in there? And they're saying, we're not going out there. Did you see how many people are out there? Okay. So here is King Saul in the opening stages of this battle. Now, Samuel had told him back in chapter 10 to wait 7 days, and Samuel the prophet would come, and he would give an offering to the Lord. So it says, verse 8, he waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. Now, there's a really important reason why God doesn't want him doing this, okay? You may remember that at the calling of King Saul's life, Samuel said to him, listen, you're going to go down with the prophets, and you're going to start to prophesy, and you're not going to know where that's coming from because the Spirit of the Lord is going to come over you just like that. And so Saul doesn't know what happens, but that's why this little proverb came about that said, is Saul not a prophet with the prophets prophesying? Right? So think about this. He had already prophesied, he was a king, and now he was trying to be a priest. Does that sound familiar anywhere? Prophet, priest, and what? King? Like there's only one person in the entire history of mankind that was supposed to fill the role of prophet, priest, and king, and his name was Jesus, not Saul. Okay? This is a really big deal to God. He doesn't want Saul offering the sacrifice. He wants Samuel, the priest, offering the sacrifice. And Samuel came, verse 10, as soon as he had finished the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him and greet him. And Samuel said, what have you done? Now stop right there. Because if you want to know if you're struggling with hiding or insecurities, then what's coming are 4 excuses. In fact, it was Gene Getz in his Life Essential Study Bible where I captured this idea from. He said, what Saul did at Gilgal was deliberate disobedience, a very serious sin. Saul took matters into his own hands and made the offerings himself. And when Samuel finally arrived, he asked Saul in no uncertain terms what he had done. And the king justified himself with excuses. Okay? So here's the thing. If you're using excuses for your wrongdoing, as I do at times, we need to spend some time with the Lord and say, Lord, what is going on in my life that I'm doing that? Okay. So here's the 4 excuses. Here's the first one. We feel alone even though God promised to be with us. We feel alone even though God promised to be with us. In fact, the The explorer Shackleton once captured it this way. He said, loneliness is the penalty of leadership. Loneliness is the penalty of leadership. There is an element where King Saul would have to be alone. Okay? In fact, Shackleton reminds us of that in one of the most daring rescues that ever took place. He was on a ship called the Endurance. It didn't endure too well because he was trying to go down to Antarctica and cross the entire continent of Antarctica on foot, something that had never been done before. So in 1914, he loaded 28 men up on this ship called the Endurance, and they sailed down to Antarctica. Now, if you're not an adventurer, you're probably saying, this sounds really stupid. Like, why would you ever do that? But he wanted to do that for his country, Great Britain, and he got down there close to Antarctica, and the ice started to come in around the ship. Now, if you know anything about ice, you know that it expands. So once he was trapped within the ice, as the ice started to freeze over, it started to crush the ship. Okay? And so Ernest Shackleton took all the guys and said, listen, the ship's not going to work, so everybody off the ship. And he put them on the floating ice. Right? And then he got their lifeboats, and he took them all a few days later, and he takes them in the lifeboats, the 28 guys, he takes them up to another little island. They find an island, they get out of there, the ship gets crushed, it sinks to the bottom, and he gets in his lifeboat and he goes up there. So he clearly understands loneliness is the penalty of leadership. He's got 28 men's lives in his hands. He places them on this island, which is an island that doesn't have any civilization on, and he says, listen, we got you all here. We've been in lifeboats for 7 days sailing to this location. I need 6 of you, and we're going to sail the additional distance, another 16 days in a lifeboat in the Antarctic, right, to get to South George Island. And there he gets to South George Island, but he's on the wrong side of the island. So he says to the guys, listen, we got all these guys back on this other island that are going to die, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hike across this island to get to the whaling village. And he gets a rescue party from the whaling village, and they go down. 497 days later, okay, Shackleton shows up with his rescue party and doesn't lose one person. Okay? Wow. I think about that, and I think, man, what must it have been like to feel the loneliness of walking across South George Island, wondering if the guys who were committed to your care are even living back there. So here's the thing. Loneliness is the penalty of leadership. Saul should have known that and turned to the Lord for his help. Instead, he didn't. He clearly feels alone. In fact, Shackleton goes on to write this regarding the rest of that idea. Loneliness is the penalty of leadership, but the man who has to make decisions is assisted greatly if he feels that there is no uncertainty in the minds of those who follow him, and that his orders will be carried out confidently in an expectation of success. Right? So let's just look at what was happening to King Saul's soldiers. Okay? So when the men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, for the people were hard-pressed, the people hid themselves in caves and holes and rocks and tombs and cisterns, and some Hebrews crossed the fords to the Jordan, to the land of Gad and Gilead, and Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Does it sound like everybody's with him? Answer? Has there ever been a stage in your life where you have felt like those who are closest to you aren't with you? Right. What do you do in that moment? Do you do what Saul does in fear? Do you say, I'm all alone? Do you forget that God has promised to be with you? In fact, just in 1 Samuel chapter 10, this is what we read. Samuel had said, now when these signs meet you, do what your hand finds to do. For, just say it with me, God is what? Yet Saul claimed that he was all alone, right? Because everybody else was either trembling or hiding in a cave, his entire army. We feel alone even though God promised to be with us, and so we throw that as an excuse. The excuse kind of sounds like this. Well, I'm the only one who cares about this. I'm the only one this matters to. No, you're not the only one it matters to. God has promised to be with you. Here's the second excuse he uses. We don't like the timing even though God affirmed he was in control. We don't like the timing even though God affirmed he was in control. There we read, in fact, just look at the text that comes next. Here's that second excuse. Verse 8, he waited 7 days for the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come. Okay. Now this is really fascinating. He's waited 7 days because in chapter 10, Samuel said, listen, wait there for me 7 days and I will come and tell you what to do. Saul says, I've waited 7 days, and I'm tired of waiting. But the word waited here is best understood as the word confident expectation, to trust, to hope. Okay? You don't see that in Saul's life. You see him saying, I should have waited with confident expectation and trust and hope, but it's the seventh day and nothing's happened. And yet the text goes on to say, as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. Now watch this, verse 9. So Saul said, bring the burnt offering here to me and peace offerings. So he's got offerings to give. He gets one offering done, and before he even gets the other one started, Samuel walks out of the woods and says, hey, what's going on here? Right? And Saul says, I waited for the seventh day, but the seventh day obviously isn't fully over yet, because he's already started that offering on the seventh day when he was supposed to wait for Samuel to come. I thought about that. This idea that we don't like the timing of something. And so even though God affirmed he was in control of it, here's a thought for you to think about. We can rush ahead of God or we can lag behind him. Both postures reveal a lack of faith. You can rush ahead of God like Saul did here. I'm tired of waiting, I'm going to do something now. Or you can lag behind God. Both of those postures reveal a lack of faith. Remember what Isaiah 40:31 says, for they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of seeing the bald eagles that kind of can circulate around South Jersey. I'm not making this up. Have any of you seen a bald eagle like in South Jersey? Yeah, okay. That's really cool, right? Except South Jersey doesn't do what the West does for bald eagles, because we don't have these these air currents that they can just ride up like forever on. So I watch the bald eagles here, and they got to work pretty hard. They got to kind of fly through whatever pollution we put up there, and they're kind of laboring, and they can't grab those air currents like they can out west. When I was out west with my father once, we were fishing, I remember just putting down my fishing pole and watching a bald eagle for like about 10 minutes, and I never saw him beat his wings. I just saw him ride on the current until he disappeared from my eyesight. He was so high up in the sky. Right? And I remember thinking, wow, I never saw him beat his wings. He just rode on what God provided for him. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. You and I, more often or not, we're not like the bald eagle. We're like the vultures who are just like flapping our wings like crazy trying to get off the ground. That's the picture of not waiting, but of working. In fact, notice the contrast in these two verses. Psalm 27:14, wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. So we can rush ahead of God. That's a lack of faith. But look at 2 Corinthians 6:2. In a favorable time I listened to you, and in a day of salvation I have helped you. This is God speaking. Behold, now is the favorable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. So sometimes when God says, okay, we're done waiting, now is the time. In that moment we say, I'm not so sure I want to do that. See, both of those elements regarding time to us can be a lack of faith. And you see it clearly in Saul's life. Faith waits, the flesh draws conclusions from what it sees. Okay? In fact, look with me. Here is his answer to Samuel. Samuel said, verse 11, what have you done? And Saul said, when I saw, see it? I didn't wait by faith, I saw something. I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed. Not exactly true, because this is the seventh day he's offering the offering on. And that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash. I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I did the sacrifices. Okay? You see what he just said? He said, listen, faith should have waited, but when I started to look at this and I saw something, I stopped living by faith, and I saw my circumstances were really, really bad, and I figured I'd better do something, so I ran ahead. There's two ways you can mess up the timing. You cannot wait when God is asking you to wait, and you cannot go when God is telling you to go. Both can be a lack of faith. Faith waits. The flesh draws conclusions from what it sees. Here's the third idea, third excuse. First one, we feel alone. Second one, we don't like the timing. Third excuse, we are afraid in our circumstances, even though God has shown he's trustworthy. We are afraid in our circumstances, even though God has shown he's trustworthy. Now, back in 1 Samuel chapter 11, my heading there says Saul defeats the Ammonites. He was facing them, and look, verse 6, and the Spirit of God rushed upon Saul when he heard the words, and his anger was greatly kindled. And he took a yoke of oxen, and he cut them in pieces, and he sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hand of the messengers, saying, whoever does not come out after Saul and Samuel, so shall it be to his oxen. Okay? And then the dread of the Lord fell upon all the people, and they came out as one man. And they battled the Ammonites, and they won. In fact, the Ammonites had held hostage, as it were, a village called Jabesh Gilead, which is a group of men. And they said, listen, we'll let you guys live if you allow us to gouge out one of your eyes so that you can't really battle us anymore. And those guys said, give us 7 days. And in those 7 days, God moved through Saul. And Saul knew, therefore, that God had moved through him. And the whole army came together. And look, at the end of that chapter, verse 15, so all the people went to Gilgal, and they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal, and there they sacrificed peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So here's the thing. Saul had known that even in the most desperate circumstances, God had shown himself trustworthy. There's a good chance that you and I know that from our past. At some stage in our past, we have seen God show himself trustworthy. But when we see the new set of circumstances that we now face, and we grow afraid in those circumstances, we simply say, well, I was afraid and so I did, as opposed to making that excuse and saying, God has shown himself trustworthy, so I did what God has asked me to do. There's a good reason why, in their circumstances, they had a reason to be afraid. Think about this for a second. There were 3,000 when they started. The Israelites had 3,000 soldiers. But look what happens after Saul gets afraid and all the people get afraid. Look with me down at verse 15. And Samuel rose, of chapter 13, and Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal. The rest of the people went up after Saul to meet the army. They went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. Okay, so he started with 3,000. Everybody's hiding in caves and cisterns and everything. Now he's down to 600. But that's not half of it. They don't even have less people. Look with me at verse 19, same chapter. Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords and spears. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines. Remember, the Philistines, they're kind of along the Mediterranean shore there. They're, if you picture the land of Israel, they got all the beachfront property, okay? The Philistines do. And that's why chariots work, because it's flatter down there. But the Israelites are living up in the hill country. So themselves, swords and spears, verse 20. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his sickle. And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares, for the mattocks, and 1/3 of the shekel for sharpening the axes and setting the goads. You say, what is that about? Just watch this, verse 22. So on the day of the battle, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan, but Saul and Jonathan, his son, had them. Are you ready for this? He's got 600 soldiers who don't even have a sword or a spear. Wow. Talk about a dangerous scenario. They already outnumber you by the thousands, and at least they have weapons. But they don't allow you to have any blacksmith, because every time they see a blacksmith try to crank up his deal, they say, we're afraid you're going to make swords. So they run the blacksmiths out, and they say the only place you can get your iron sharpened is down here where the Philistines are, and so the people keep going down there. They have no blacksmiths, they have no weapons, and they have way less people. They don't have the right resources, and they don't have the right amount of people. There's circumstances that could have caused him to be afraid. Now, I had a chance this past week to talk to a guy by the name of Daniel Henderson, who operates something known as Strategic Renewal, which is a prayer ministry that's kind of nationwide. And I was asking Daniel the question, like, if you could tell men just one thing about praying, what would you tell them? Right? And he gave me a really fascinating answer, one I hadn't thought about. So here it is. Here's his answer. Desperation can come through crisis or cultivation. I've sought to cultivate that desperation by focusing first on God's worthiness. When I've done so, I have found it easier to see my neediness. You say, what does that have to do with this? Everything. Maybe the circumstances God is bringing you and me that make us frightened are because God wants us to come to that point of recognizing our neediness and desperation. You got two ways you can get that. You can get that through crisis, or you can get that through cultivation. What if you and I said, okay, I know that's the position God wants me in, so that when I pray, I really call out to him. I'm just not praying obligatory, but I'm really saying, Lord, I'm really in need. What if I begin to cultivate that level of neediness in my heart? Could it be possible that God wouldn't have to resort to a crisis in my life for me to recognize my neediness and desperation? Maybe part of the reason you and I struggle with the crises in our life so much is because God has said, that's the only way I can bring you to me. What if we just learn to cultivate that? Like King David did when he wrote a ton of Psalms about recognizing who God was in all his splendor and glory and who he was in his neediness. King Saul doesn't do that. And so King Saul faces crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis. Here's what I want you to see. We are afraid in our circumstances, so we make bad decisions, even though God has shown us that he has been trustworthy. Don't use that excuse. One last one, here it is. We are trying to impress God, even though he offers grace for our failures. Saul says in 1 Samuel 13, he says, Samuel said, what have you done? And Saul said, when I saw the people were scattering, down in verse 12, I said, now the Philistines will come down against Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. Now that sounds almost exactly like Aaron. Remember what Aaron said? So I threw this gold in the fire, and out came a calf. Okay, right? I'm not sure how that happened. Right? That almost sounds like what Saul is saying here. I forced myself to do this. I really didn't want to. The truth of the matter is, Samuel could have said, you're a liar. You wanted to. You were so afraid that you said, maybe I can impress God by offering sacrifices. And you forgot that God says over in 1 Samuel 15:22, when Saul runs into the same kind of problem, God says to him through Samuel, listen, to obey is better than sacrifice. By faith, obey me and trust my grace to meet you at your failure. There are certain passages that, like I've said this to you before, but when I'm studying them and preparing, they're like working in my heart. In my heart, you only get probably a part of that because I try my best to articulate it. But the Spirit of God reminded me again this week on multiple occasions that I have a tendency to make excuses for my wrong choices and decisions. Maybe you do too. Maybe you say, well, but I was alone. Maybe you say, I'm really uncomfortable with this timing. I need to do something now. Maybe you say, Phil, if you knew all my circumstances, you'd know why I'm afraid, okay, and why I'm making these bad decisions. Maybe you might say, all I want to do is try to impress God, as opposed to saying, God is not impressed by my sacrifices. He will, however, honor the one who comes with humility and says to God, I'm in need. Okay? That's where you and I should be this morning. Don't try to impress God because he offers grace for your failures. You don't live a perfect life before God. Right? You simply say, Lord, I tried. This was the best I could do. Here I have sinned. Will you forgive? And God offers grace in those circumstances. We close this morning in kind of a unique way with the Lord's table, reminding us of that. The Lord's table, the bread and the cup, are great reminders of this picture that Jesus Christ, the only one who lived perfectly, came and died in our place. We tend to forget that. God gives us the chance to remember that this morning. Whatever excuses you've been making, whatever circumstances you've been facing, I just want to encourage you, look at the cup and bread this morning and just say thank you. Say thank you to God for the grace that he gave that we did not deserve.